Walking home from the diner that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in months. The summer heat that had seemed oppressive earlier now felt warm and energizing, like the sun was charging batteries I hadn't realized were nearly dead. The betrayal I'd experienced at Morrison's was still painful, but it was beginning to feel like a chapter in a larger story, rather than the end of the book. Sometimes I realized what feels like devastation is actually liberation in disguise, freeing us from situations that were limiting our growth, even when they felt comfortable and familiar. 6 months after leaving Morrison's, I was sitting in my new home office, a converted bedroom that had become the headquarters for what I'd started calling Cornerstone Consulting. The name had come to me during one of those 3 in the morning moments of clarity that sometimes arrive when we're not actively seeking them. I'd realized that all my years of experience, all the knowledge I'd accumulated about customer service, team management, and business operations, weren't outdated relics, but rather foundational stones that smaller businesses needed to build their own success upon. The phone call that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Sarah Martinez, who had left Morrison's 3 years earlier to start her own landscaping business, had heard through Linda Chan about my consulting work and wanted to meet. As we sat in her truck outside a client's property, she shared her struggles with managing a growing team, maintaining customer relationships, and dealing with the kind of workplace dynamics that had once seemed so simple when viewed from the outside. Her frustration was palpable, but so was her determination to build something better than what she'd left behind. What struck me most about our conversation was how familiar her challenges sounded, and how applicable my experience was to her situation. The skills I'd developed at Morrison's, the hard-earned wisdom about reading people and managing relationships, the understanding of what motivates employees and what drives customers away, all of it translated directly to her world. But more than that, she valued these insights in a way that my former colleagues never had. She saw my experience not as a burden from the past, but as a roadmap for the future she was trying to create. As my consulting practice grew, I began to understand something profound about the nature of loyalty and betrayal in professional relationships. The people who had dismissed me at Morrison's hadn't been rejecting my actual capabilities. They'd been rejecting what I represented to them. To David and his allies, I was a reminder of an older way of doing business, a symbol of the generational divide they were trying to bridge by proving their own relevance. Their betrayal wasn't really about me at all. It was about their own insecurities and their need to establish their place in a hierarchy they felt threatened by. This realization brought with it a kind of peace I hadn't expected. The anger and frustration that had consumed me for months began to dissipate, replaced by something more valuable: understanding. I started to see David's betrayal not as a personal attack, but as the desperate maneuvering of someone who felt he needed to diminish others to elevate himself. The tragedy wasn't what he'd done to me, but what he'd done to himself in the process, trading the possibility of genuine mentorship and friendship for the temporary security of tribal belonging. The most important lesson, though, came from recognizing my own role in the dynamic that had developed. I'd been so invested in being needed, so hungry for the validation that came from helping someone younger navigate their challenges, that I'd ignored the warning signs of insincerity. My desire to matter, to feel relevant in a changing workplace, had made me vulnerable to manipulation. Not because I was naive, but because I'd confused being useful with being valued. And I'd forgotten that true respect has to be earned through mutual recognition, rather than one-sided generosity. Working with small business owners over the following months taught me something else, crucial about trust and loyalty in professional environments. The clients who valued my expertise most were those who understood that experience isn't about clinging to old methods, but about having seen enough cycles to recognize what endures and what's merely fashionable. They weren't looking for someone to validate their existing approaches. They wanted someone who could help them build on solid foundations while adapting to new realities. This was the kind of professional relationship I'd been seeking all along, one based on mutual respect rather than dependency. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. I began to understand that my worth as a person, and as a professional, didn't depend on any single workplace or relationship. The confidence I'd lost at Morrison's wasn't really confidence at all. It was a kind of institutional validation that could be withdrawn at any time by people who didn't truly understand my value. Real confidence, I learned, comes from knowing your own capabilities and finding environments where those capabilities can flourish, rather than trying to force acceptance in places where you're not genuinely wanted. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to distinguish between isolation and independence. The loneliness I'd felt during those final months at Morrison's hadn't been about being physically alone. It had been about being surrounded by people who no longer saw me clearly. The solitude of building my own consulting practice, by contrast, was full of possibility and potential. I was alone by choice, building something that reflected my values and priorities rather than adapting myself to fit someone else's vision of what I should be. The irony of David's betrayal was that it had freed me from a situation that was slowly diminishing my potential. If he hadn't systematically undermined my position at Morrison's, I might have stayed there for another decade, growing increasingly frustrated with my limited role and declining influence. His actions, intended to sideline me, had actually launched me into a new phase of my career that was more fulfilling and financially rewarding than anything I'd experienced before. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are actually doing us the greatest favor, even if neither of us recognizes it at the time. By winter, as I prepared my first annual report for the small business association I joined, I realized I had something to be grateful for. Not grateful for the betrayal itself, but grateful for what it had revealed about my own resilience and adaptability. The woman who had left Morrison's in defeat and confusion had evolved into someone who could navigate professional relationships with greater wisdom and clearer boundaries. The pain of that experience had been real and significant, but it had also been transformative in ways I never could have anticipated when I was living through the worst of it. As I sit here today, nearly 2 years removed from those painful months at Morrison's Hardware, I want to leave you with some questions that might help you navigate your own professional relationships with greater awareness and wisdom. These are the questions I wish I'd asked myself before I invested so deeply in someone who saw my generosity as weakness rather than strength. First, ask yourself, are the people around you genuinely interested in your growth and success, or are they primarily focused on what you can do for them? True professional relationships should be reciprocal, with both parties investing in each other's development and advancement. If you find yourself always giving and never receiving, always mentoring and never being mentored, that imbalance is a warning sign worth paying attention to. Second, consider this. Do you feel comfortable setting boundaries with the people you work closely with? Or do you find yourself saying yes to every request because you're afraid of losing their approval? Healthy professional relationships can withstand boundaries and honest communication about limits and expectations. If someone pulls away from you because you've established reasonable limits, they were probably more interested in what you could provide than in who you are as a person. Finally, reflect on this. Are you building your sense of professional worth on external validation from specific people or institutions? Or do you have an internal compass that guides your understanding of your own value? The most devastating betrayals happen when we've made other people's opinions the foundation of our self-worth. When that foundation crumbles, we crumble with it, unless we've built something more solid to stand on. The truth is, workplace betrayal will probably touch most of our lives at some point. In a world where people are competing for limited opportunities, where generational differences create tension, and where change happens so rapidly that everyone feels pressure to prove their relevance, the temptation to advance at others' expense is real and persistent. But that doesn't mean we should become cynical or stop investing in meaningful professional relationships. What it means is that we need to become more discerning about where we place our trust, more aware of the signs that someone is using our openness against us, and more committed to building our sense of worth on foundations that can't be shaken by other people's choices. We need to learn the difference between being generous and being gullible, between being supportive and being naive. If you've experienced workplace betrayal yourself, I want you to know that the pain you're feeling is valid, and that the time you need to process that pain is worthwhile. But I also want you to consider the possibility that this experience, as devastating as it might feel right now, could be redirecting you towards something better than what you've lost. Sometimes the people who push us out of situations that aren't serving us are doing us a favor, even when that's not their intention. Your experience, your knowledge, your wisdom, these things have value that exists independent of any single workplace or relationship. The right people will recognize that value and want to build something meaningful with you. The wrong people will try to diminish it because it threatens their own insecurities. Learning to tell the difference between these two types of people might be one of the most important skills you can develop in your professional life. So take the time you need to heal from whatever betrayal you've experienced, but don't let that healing turn into permanent hiding. The world needs what you have to offer, and there are people out there who will value your contributions in the way they deserve to be valued. Your job is to find them, and their job is to find you. Trust that process, even when it feels uncertain, because the alternative is allowing someone else's poor choices to determine the trajectory of your life. Remember, the best response to betrayal isn't revenge or bitterness. It's building something so fulfilling and successful that the betrayal becomes irrelevant. That's not always easy, and it's not always quick, but it's always possible if you're willing to do the work of rediscovering your own value and finding the right environment for it to flourish. If this story resonated with your own experience, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our stories of workplace betrayal and recovery can help others feel less alone in their own journeys. And if you found value in these insights, consider subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications so you can continue learning about navigating complex workplace relationships with wisdom and resilience. There's always more to discover about building the kind of professional life that honors your worth and protects your peace of mind. Introduction. You know that feeling when someone you've poured your heart into helping suddenly turns around and uses everything you've shared against you? When the person you've mentored, supported, and trusted becomes the architect of your professional downfall. If you've ever experienced the sting of workplace betrayal, especially when it comes from someone you genuinely cared about, then you'll understand the story I'm about to share with you. Most people think workplace betrayal is about big, dramatic moments, stolen promotions, or backstabbing in boardrooms. But the truth is, the most devastating betrayals happen quietly, in the everyday interactions where trust is built and then systematically dismantled. They happen when someone we've invested in decides that our downfall is worth their advancement, when loyalty becomes a one-way street, and when the very act of caring becomes our greatest vulnerability. What I learned through my own experience of workplace betrayal changed not just how I view professional relationships, but how I understand the dynamics of trust, loyalty, and self-worth in any environment where people compete for limited resources and recognition. The story you're about to hear isn't just about what happened to me at Morrison's Hardware. It's about the universal patterns of human behavior that play out in offices, stores, restaurants, and workshops across the country every single day. But here's what I want you to know before we dive in. This isn't a story about becoming cynical or building walls around yourself. It's about learning to recognize the difference between genuine connection and strategic manipulation, between people who value your experience and those who see it as a threat to their own advancement. Most importantly, it's about discovering that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best outcomes, if we're willing to learn from them rather than be destroyed by them. I used to work at Morrison's Hardware, a family-owned store that had been serving our small town of Cedar Falls for over 30 years. The smell of sawdust and motor oil filled the air every morning when I unlocked the front door, and I'd grown to love that familiar scent over my 15 years there. At 52, I thought I'd found my place in the world, surrounded by tools and honest work, helping customers fix their broken fences and leaky pipes. But sometimes, the things we trust most are the ones that end up cutting us deepest. It was a Tuesday morning in March when David first knocked on my office door. He'd been hired 3 months earlier as an assistant manager, fresh out of business school with ideas about modernizing our inventory system. I remember he looked nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup as he asked if we could talk. His voice carried that hesitant tone people use when they're about to share something personal. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same worn leather chair where I'd counseled dozens of employees over the years about everything from work schedules to family troubles. "I don't know who else to talk to," he said, his eyes avoiding mine as he spoke. "Everyone here seems so established, so confident. I feel like I'm drowning in all these procedures and expectations." His admission touched something in me, reminding me of my own early days at Morrison's when I'd felt equally lost and overwhelmed. I leaned forward, offering him the same patient attention I'd given countless others before him. "The thing is," he continued, "I'm not sure I'm cut out for this. Maybe I made a mistake leaving my previous job." I found myself sharing stories from my own journey, telling him about the mistakes I'd made, the lessons I'd learned the hard way. There was something genuine in his gratitude, the way he nodded and asked follow-up questions that made me feel heard and valued. For the first time in months, I felt that familiar warmth of connection, the satisfaction of knowing my experience could help someone navigate their own challenges. Trust, I've learned, often begins with these small moments of vulnerability, when someone opens their heart and we respond with understanding rather than judgment. As weeks passed, David began stopping by my office regularly, always with that same apologetic knock and hesitant smile. He'd update me on his progress, share his frustrations with difficult customers, and ask for advice on handling inventory discrepancies. These conversations became the highlight of my day, giving me a sense of purpose that had been missing from my routine tasks. I started bringing an extra coffee for him, learning that he preferred it black with just a touch of sugar. The simple act of caring for someone else's small preferences felt meaningful in a way that surprised me. Our friendship deepened through these daily exchanges, and I found myself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation I hadn't felt in years. He had a way of making me feel needed, not just as a coworker, but as a mentor and confidant. When he struggled with a particularly challenging customer return, I'd walk him through the process step by step. When he felt overwhelmed by the weekly inventory reports, I'd stay late to help him organize the numbers. The confidence he gained from our interactions seemed to reflect back on me, validating my years of experience in ways I hadn't realized I needed. But trust, like a delicate flower, requires consistent care and attention. It grows slowly, nurtured by small acts of honesty and reliability, yet can be destroyed in an instant by carelessness or betrayal. I was about to learn this lesson in the most painful way possible, discovering that the very person I'd invested so much care in was systematically undermining the foundation of confidence I'd spent years building. The signs were already there, subtle as shadows at dusk, but I was too invested in what I thought our friendship meant to recognize them for what they truly were. The change started so gradually that I almost missed it entirely. You know how it is when you're watching a sunset, how the light fades so imperceptibly that you don't notice until suddenly everything is darker. That's how David's behavior shifted, degree by degree, until I found myself squinting in the dim light of what our friendship had become. It began with small things, barely noticeable deviations from our established routine that I dismissed as normal variations in human behavior. Where once he'd knock on my door with that familiar hesitant tap, now he'd poke his head in quickly, almost furtively, as if he were checking to see if anyone else was around. His questions became more pointed, less about seeking guidance and more about gathering specific information. "How does Mr. Morrison usually handle vendor disputes?" he'd ask, or "What's the real story behind why Sarah left last year?" At the time, I interpreted these inquiries as natural curiosity from someone trying to understand the workplace dynamics. But looking back, I realized he was mapping the territory, learning where the power lay and how to navigate it. The morning conversations that had once stretched comfortably over 20 or 30 minutes began shrinking to brief exchanges. He'd still bring up his challenges, but now he seemed more interested in my responses than in the conversation itself. I noticed him taking mental notes, filing away my suggestions with a kind of calculated efficiency that felt different from his previous grateful absorption. When I'd ask about his weekend, or share a funny story about a customer, he'd respond with polite but distant acknowledgement, as if he were checking items off a conversational to-do list, rather than engaging with a friend. The biggest change, though, was in his eyes. You can learn a lot about a person's true intentions by watching how they look at you. And David's gaze had shifted from warm attention to something more analytical, more assessing. When I'd explain a procedure or share an insight about managing difficult customers, he'd nod along, but I could sense him evaluating rather than absorbing. It was like watching someone study a painting, not for its beauty, but to determine its market value. The warmth that had initially drawn me to help him was cooling into something more transactional. I started noticing him having longer conversations with other employees, particularly the younger ones who'd been hired in the past year. Through my office window, I'd watch him laughing with them by the loading dock, engaging in the kind of easy camaraderie that had once characterized our interactions. There was an energy in these exchanges that felt different from our mentoring sessions, more genuine somehow, as if he was finally relaxing into relationships that didn't require the careful performance he'd begun bringing to our meetings. The professional environment, I've learned, can be a strange ecosystem where alliances shift like sand dunes in the wind. What seems solid and permanent one day can be completely reshaped by the next storm. I was beginning to sense that the landscape around me was changing, that the loyalty I'd believed in was perhaps more fragile than I'd imagined. The question was whether I was reading the signs correctly, or if my own insecurities were coloring my perception of what was actually happening. Still, I told myself these changes were temporary, that David was simply adjusting to his role and finding his footing with the rest of the team. After all, wasn't this what I'd wanted for him? To gain confidence and build relationships throughout the store. I pushed down the small voice that whispered about betrayal and disappointment, choosing instead to trust in the foundation we'd built together. But foundations, as I would soon learn, are only as strong as the soil beneath them, and sometimes that soil has been quietly eroding for longer than we ever suspected. The moment of truth came on a Thursday afternoon in late April, during what should have been an ordinary lunch break in the store's small break room. I was sitting at my usual spot by the window, eating a sandwich I'd brought from home, when I heard David's voice rise above the general chatter. He was standing near the vending machines with 3 other employees, including Jake, one of our newer hires who couldn't have been more than 25. The conversation seemed casual enough at first, just typical workplace banter about weekend plans and upcoming inventory deadlines. But then David's tone shifted, taking on that particular quality that signals someone is about to deliver what they think is a clever punchline. "Well, if you really want to know how we did things in the Stone Age," he said, gesturing broadly toward my table, "just ask our resident historian over there. She probably remembers when we kept inventory on stone tablets." The group erupted in laughter, the kind of sharp, excluding laughter that cuts through a room like a blade. I felt my sandwich turn to cardboard in my mouth as I realized he was talking about me, reducing our months of meaningful conversation to a dismissive joke about my age. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the words themselves, but because of the calculated nature of the performance. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of poor judgment. It was a deliberate choice to sacrifice our friendship for the approval of his new peer group. I watched as he continued to build on the joke, mimicking what he claimed was my old-fashioned way of explaining procedures, exaggerating my mannerisms for comedic effect. Each imitation felt like another small death, a piece of trust that would never be recovered. What made the moment even more crushing was the realization that he'd been storing up these observations, cataloging my quirks and methods not out of respect for my experience, but as material for future mockery. The coffee I'd brought him every morning, the extra hours I'd spent helping him understand our systems, the personal stories I'd shared to make him feel welcome, all of it had been reduced to ammunition in his campaign to establish himself as part of the younger, more progressive faction of our workplace. The frustration I felt wasn't just about the humiliation. It was about the systematic way he'd harvested my goodwill, only to weaponize it against me. I sat there in stunned silence, my face burning with embarrassment and anger, as the group's laughter gradually died down and moved on to other topics. But David wasn't finished. Throughout the rest of the lunch break, he continued to make subtle references to outdated methods and resistance to change, each comment clearly directed at me, even when he wasn't looking in my direction. It was like watching someone systematically dismantle a relationship while pretending it had never existed in the first place. The most painful part was recognizing that this wasn't an isolated incident, but likely the culmination of weeks or months of similar conversations that had been happening outside my awareness. How many times had he entertained other employees with stories about my dinosaur approaches to customer service? How many of my confidential admissions about feeling out of place in the modern workplace had been shared as entertainment? The depth of the betrayal was staggering, not just in its execution, but in its premeditation. As I walked back to my office after lunch, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The confidence I'd built over 15 years at Morrison's, the sense of belonging that had made each day meaningful, began to crumble like a house built on sand. I realized that while I'd been nurturing what I thought was a genuine friendship, David had been systematically undermining my standing with the rest of the team. The supermarket of trust I'd been shopping in had been selling expired goods all along, and I was the last one to notice the smell of decay. The weeks following that devastating lunch break brought a kind of professional loneliness I'd never experienced before. It was like being slowly erased from a picture, with each day bringing new evidence that my place in the Morrisons family was being systematically edited out. The morning greetings that had once punctuated my arrival became scattered and brief, delivered with the kind of polite distance people reserve for acquaintances rather than long-term colleagues. I'd walk through the store aisles, past employees I'd trained and mentored, only to be met with awkward nods and averted eyes. David had become something of a ringleader in this campaign of exclusion, though he executed it with the kind of subtle sophistication that made it nearly impossible to confront directly. He'd organize impromptu meetings about inventory procedures, discussions that logically should have included me given my years of experience, but somehow my name never appeared on the hastily scrawled participant lists. When I'd ask about these gatherings, he'd respond with that practiced look of surprise, as if my exclusion had been an unfortunate oversight rather than a deliberate choice. The social geography of our workplace began to shift around me like tectonic plates, creating new fault lines that left me increasingly isolated on my own small island of irrelevance. Coffee breaks that had once been communal affairs became private conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The loading dock, where employees traditionally gathered to share gossip and decompress from difficult customers, became a place where laughter died when I approached. Even the simple act of eating lunch became a navigation exercise, as I learned to time my breaks to avoid the uncomfortable silence that my presence seemed to create. Most painful of all was watching David cultivate the very relationships I'd hoped our friendship might help him build. He'd arrived at Morrison's as an awkward outsider, uncertain of his place in our established social ecosystem, but now he moved through the store with the confidence of someone who'd found his tribe. The younger employees, particularly those who'd been hired in the past year, seemed to orbit around him like planets around a sun. They'd gather in clusters during quiet periods, sharing inside jokes and making plans for after-work gatherings that I was clearly not invited to join. The isolation reached its peak during our monthly staff meeting in early May. These gatherings had traditionally been collaborative affairs where everyone's input was valued and sought, but this particular meeting felt different from the moment I walked into the conference room. David had positioned himself at what had become the unofficial head of the table, surrounded by his core group of supporters. When I took my usual seat, I noticed the subtle way conversations adjusted around me, topics shifting to exclude references to shared experiences or inside knowledge that I might contribute to. When Mr. Morrison asked for suggestions about improving customer service during the busy summer season, I raised my hand to share an idea based on a successful program we'd implemented 5 years earlier. But before I could finish explaining the concept, David interrupted with a comment about the need for fresh approaches and modern solutions. The room's attention shifted to him as he outlined a plan that was essentially identical to mine, but framed as innovative thinking rather than historical precedent. The frustration I felt watching my experience be repackaged as someone else's insight was matched only by the disappointment of seeing my colleagues nod approvingly at this theft of intellectual property. The meeting continued with discussions about scheduling changes, inventory procedures, and customer feedback protocols, but I found myself increasingly marginalized from each conversation. My attempts to participate were met with polite but dismissive responses, as if I were a well-meaning but out-of-touch relative offering outdated advice at a family gathering. By the time the meeting ended, I felt like a ghost haunting my own workplace, visible but somehow not quite present, acknowledged but not included. The sense of belonging I'd cultivated over 15 years had been replaced by a profound sense of displacement, as if I were visiting a place that had once been home, but now belonged to someone else entirely. The end came on a sweltering Tuesday in early June, the kind of day when the air conditioning in our old building struggled to keep up with the heat, radiating from the asphalt parking lot outside. I arrived at Morrison's that morning with the same stubborn determination I'd been carrying for weeks, refusing to let the growing hostility around me drive me away from the job I'd poured my heart into for 15 years. But sometimes the universe has a way of making decisions for us, creating moments so crystalline in their clarity that we can no longer pretend we don't see the truth that's been staring us in the face. Mr. Morrison had called me into his office just after lunch, his weathered face carrying the kind of expression that immediately signals bad news. He'd been avoiding eye contact for several days, and now I understood why. The manila folder on his desk contained what he called my performance evaluation, though the document inside bore little resemblance to the glowing reviews I'd received consistently over the years. According to this new assessment, I was resistant to change, inflexible in my approach to customer service, and struggling to adapt to the evolving needs of the business. Each criticism felt like a betrayal, not just of my work performance, but of the relationship I'd thought we'd built over the years. The most devastating part was reading between the lines and recognizing David's fingerprints all over the evaluation. The specific examples cited, the language used to describe my supposed shortcomings, even the timing of incidents mentioned, all pointed to a systematic campaign to document my failures while ignoring my contributions. It was like watching a skilled artist create a portrait that captured my external features while completely missing my essence. The frustration wasn't just about the unfairness of it all. It was about the realization that I'd been naive enough to believe that loyalty and hard work would speak for themselves. Mr. Morrison's suggestion that I consider early retirement or pursuing opportunities elsewhere was delivered with the kind of gentle firmness that made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion at all. He spoke about generational changes in the workplace and the need for fresh perspectives, as if these were natural phenomena rather than deliberate choices, about who was valued and who wasn't. The pension package he outlined was generous enough to soften the blow, but not generous enough to mask the fact that I was being pushed out of the place I'd considered my professional home. As I sat in that stuffy office, listening to this man I'd respected and trusted explain why my services were no longer needed, I felt the last vestiges of my professional identity crumble away. The confidence I'd built over decades of successful customer interactions, problem-solving, and team leadership was being systematically demolished by a few months of calculated undermining. It was like watching a house you'd built with your own hands being torn down by strangers who claimed it was outdated and unsafe, despite the fact that it had weathered every storm for 15 years. The walk back to my office after that meeting felt like the longest journey of my life. Every step carried the weight of finality, the knowledge that I was seeing familiar surroundings through the lens of ending rather than continuity. The smell of motor oil and lumber that had once been comforting now felt heavy and oppressive, like inhaling the atmosphere of a place that no longer wanted me. Colleagues who had been avoiding me for weeks now seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to be looking elsewhere whenever I passed by, as if my newfound status as a departing employee had made me literally invisible. David was standing by the customer service counter when I walked through the main floor, engaged in animated conversation with two of the newer employees about some upcoming procedural change. He glanced up as I passed, and for just a moment, our eyes met across the space that had once felt like common ground. There was something in his expression that might have been guilt, or maybe just the awkwardness of encountering someone whose trust he'd systematically betrayed. But whatever momentary discomfort he felt was quickly replaced by that practiced look of professional indifference, as if I were just another customer passing through his field of vision rather than the person who'd invested countless hours in his success. The irony wasn't lost on me that David had achieved exactly what he'd set out to do. When he first knocked on my office door all those months ago, he'd gained the confidence and established the relationships he'd claimed to want, just not in the way either of us had originally envisioned. The mentorship I'd provided had been real, but it had been a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Now, with his position secure and his alliances firmly established, he no longer needed the bridge I provided to his new professional home. The bridge had served its purpose and could be safely burned. The first month after leaving Morrison's passed in a haze of disorientation and unexpected grief. I found myself waking up at 5:30 each morning, my body still programmed for the routine that had structured my days for 15 years, only to remember that I no longer had anywhere to go. The empty hours stretched before me like an unfamiliar landscape, devoid of the familiar landmarks that had once given my life meaning and direction. I'd sit at my kitchen table with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and wonder what exactly I was supposed to do with all this unwanted freedom. The financial cushion from my severance package meant I didn't have to worry about immediate survival, but it also removed the urgent necessity that might have forced me into action. Instead, I drifted through days that felt simultaneously endless and purposeless, haunted by the phantom pain of professional rejection and the deeper ache of personal betrayal. I'd drive to the grocery store or the post office, simple errands that had once been squeezed between work responsibilities, and feel like an actor who'd forgotten their lines in a play that was continuing without them. That grief, I discovered, has its own timeline and its own wisdom. Just as the body knows how to heal from physical injuries, the spirit has its own mechanisms for processing loss and finding new sources of strength. The turning point came during a chance encounter at Murphy's Diner, a place I'd been frequenting more often since I had nowhere else to be at lunchtime. I was sitting in my usual booth, picking at a grilled cheese sandwich and trying to lose myself in the local newspaper, when a voice behind me said, "Excuse me, aren't you Margaret from Morrison's Hardware?" I turned to find Linda Chun, a woman I'd helped several times over the years with various home repair projects. She was probably in her 40s, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from running your own business, which in her case was a small accounting firm downtown. What struck me wasn't just that she remembered me, but the genuine warmth in her voice as she asked if she could join me for coffee. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen and valued, not as a relic from the past but as a person whose knowledge and experience had genuine worth. Linda's conversation was a revelation, not because she said anything particularly profound, but because she spoke to me as if my expertise mattered. She was dealing with some challenges in her office setup, and wanted advice about organizing her filing systems and improving her customer service protocols. As we talked, I felt something awakening inside me that I thought was permanently damaged. The confidence that comes from knowing you have valuable skills and insights to offer. The frustration and disappointment that had been weighing me down began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since those early days of mentoring David. Our conversation lasted over 2 hours, ranging from practical business advice to broader discussions about workplace dynamics and the challenges of running a small operation in a changing economy. Linda listened to my suggestions with the kind of attention and respect I'd been missing, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on her phone. When she mentioned that several other small business owners in her network were struggling with similar challenges, something clicked into place. Maybe my experience at Morrison's hadn't been the end of my professional story, but rather the preparation for a new chapter I hadn't yet imagined. The idea of consulting work hadn't occurred to me before that conversation, but as Linda and I exchanged contact information and made plans to meet again, I felt a spark of excitement I hadn't experienced in months. Here was an opportunity to use everything I'd learned over 15 years of retail management, customer service, and team leadership, but without the political complications and generational tensions that had made my last months at Morrison's so miserable. Instead of being viewed as outdated or resistant to change, I could be seen as a resource, someone with hard-won wisdom about what works and what doesn't in the real world of business. Walking home from the diner that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in months. The summer heat that had seemed oppressive earlier now felt warm and energizing, like the sun was charging batteries I hadn't realized were nearly dead. The betrayal I'd experienced at Morrison's was still painful, but it was beginning to feel like a chapter in a larger story rather than the end of the book. Sometimes I realized what feels like devastation is actually liberation in disguise, freeing us from situations that were limiting our growth even when they felt comfortable and familiar.